Okay, so in this lecture, I want to really cover the sort of last two objections to utilitarianism. And I think these are the most serious practical objections to the theory. You know, this objection that utilitarianism doesn't do well with fairness or respect for persons, and this idea that things besides consequences matter and utilitarianism doesn't factor that in. So I want to say a little bit about what I mean by that, and also why utilitarianism has problems. And I think this Ursula Le Guin story I had you guys read, Those Who Walk Away from Omelas, does a really good job of illustrating these issues and showing why utilitarianism has a problem with them. So remember, the setup of the story is that there's this city, Omelas, everybody's really happy there. The city is wonderfully prosperous. It's beautiful, great works of art, just a wonderful place to live, right? The way Le Guin sketches it, it's almost a paradise. But in Le Guin's story, somehow, this is a science fiction fantasy story, somehow the prosperity of this city requires that they basically keep an innocent child just locked in a filthy room in the dark for its entire life. And I think, yes, this is fantasy, but let's go along with it because I think it raises some really uncomfortable questions for the utilitarian. The first of these being, is doing this to this child morally right? Well, I think most of us, if we're just, before we take a moral philosophy class, most of us, our first reaction, and I think it's a pretty sound, a pretty good one, would just be to say, no, it's not. You shouldn't do this to this innocent child. Problem is, the utilitarian is really strongly pushed to say that it is right to do this to this child, right? What is the suffering of one child compared to the incredible happiness of tens of thousands? We can even up the numbers and say hundreds of thousands of people in the city. If in some way making this child's life miserable for his or her entire life, if in some way it's necessary to do that to make the rest of the city happy, I think the utilitarian would have to say, do it. Well, that seems to be a problem. The second thing, Le Guin says, well, most people, everybody has to see that this child suffers, and most people bothered by it for a little bit, get over it, go back to their day-to-day life, right? Well, but some protest. They leave the city. And so we might ask, should they do that? Should they, they see this incredible suffering, this what they would think of as an evil. They don't want to be a part of it. They protest by leaving. And now look, some of you guys might be saying, well, they should stay and fight. There's a modern sci-fi writer, N.K. Jemisin. She actually wrote a story in response, Those Who Stay and Fight, right? But look, imagine that there's nothing you can do, right? If you stay and fight, maybe they're just going to throw you in a little room, right? Nothing you can do to make the situation better. Even if that's the case, isn't there something to be said for leaving, for not being part of this horrible injustice? Should people do it? I think a lot of us would say, well, even if I don't have the guts to do it, I don't know what I would do. People should do it. And even if you don't think that maybe it's the right thing to do, you might ask yourself, is there something praiseworthy, something admirable or good about leaving? Should we maybe admire these people? And I think it's hard to say no, right? There is something to admire in someone taking a moral stand. Utilitarians are going to have trouble with that. Let's go more deeply into all of these points and see where the problem is and how the utilitarian responds. Well, look, I think this story nicely illustrates this idea that utilitarianism does badly with fairness and respect for persons, right? Look, one thing about what's wrong here is it's just not fair to ask one person to make such huge sacrifices for the good of other people. It's not fair to make this child miserable so that other people can be happy. But for the utilitarian, that just doesn't matter. Look, they don't really care about fairness. Remember, for them, it's all pleasure and the absence of pain. Now, they care about fairness to the extent that, like, most of us care about fairness, and if we do something horribly unfair, it'll make us unhappy. But the utilitarian does not care about fairness in and of itself. The fact that it's unfair to ask for such huge sacrifices from a person, that just doesn't register on their radar. Another issue here is that there are certain things you should never do to another human being. There's this idea that human beings have a certain kind of dignity, that they deserve respect. And what the city does to this child, well, that's one of those things you shouldn't do to another human being. You should not use a human being in this way to create, even if by doing so you can create all this happiness. This just doesn't fit with what we think human beings deserve: respect for persons. So how might a utilitarian respond to the issues Le Guin's story raises? Well, let's see. Mill doesn't really say too much about this. He talks a bit about justice, but I'm not sure how, convincing his response is. But I think Mill will say, well, in real-world cases, utilitarianism does pretty well. Maybe he's right. We'll talk about that in a second. And I think you could just say, as engineers sometimes say and programmers sometimes say, garbage in, garbage out. What do I mean by that? Well, Le Guin has sketched us a weird science fiction case. Well, what's so weird about the idea that in a weird science fiction case, you get weird results? Yes, it seems a weird result that you should leave this kid confined, that the city should do this. But, it's a bizarre case. Maybe bizarre cases give bizarre answers. Utilitarian might say, well, in real world, what matters is not whether some clever sci-fi writer like Ursula Le Guin can think of some way where my theory would give weird answers. Well, what matters is my theory going to give good answers in the real world? I take the point there, but I think there's two things to say. One, ideally, it would be best if a theory could give us, the right answer even in weird theoretical cases. It does seem to be a mark against utilitarianism that it can't. Now, I'm not going to put too much weight on that, but the more serious problem is this. You can get similar weird results where utilitarianism doesn't do well with fairness or respect for persons in real-world cases. I'll give you guys a much simpler one, much less low stakes, but here's a case where utilitarianism doesn't seem to do well with fairness. Years ago, this was not at TCC, I should add, but years ago I was teaching a logic class. And one of my students, the grades were 4 exams, she just didn't show up for one of them, and one of them she only did half of. The other 2 that she showed up and completed, she also didn't do so great on. Now, but look, simple math tells you if one of the 4 assignments for class you simply don't do, and one other one you only do half of, you're going to get a bad grade, right? This did not seem to occur to her. So I go home for Christmas. I'm not checking my email. I'm at my parents'. At that time, they didn't have internet access. I go and check my email after Christmas, and I have loads of emails from the student complaining, and I quote, that I have ruined Christmas. She is now on academic probation because she got a D in the class. That is my fault, and I've ruined Christmas. Well, now look. Why do I tell this story? Well, I think it's ridiculous. I tell it because I think it's funny. And maybe to give you guys some idea of how I respond to, pushing about grading, which is usually I'm digging my heels. But look, this student kept pestering me, just harassing me. Every time I would open my email, she would just be telling me that she wanted her grade changed. And it was obvious what she wanted to do was annoy and harass me until I gave her a passing grade in the class. I didn't do it because she hadn't earned it. Plenty of people were as lazy as she was, and they took their F's and D's, and it wouldn't be fair to them to give her a grade that she didn't earn just because she's a lot more annoying than they are. This was a hard class. Lots of people put in a lot of work and got passing grades, even A's and B's. It wouldn't be fair to those people either to give somebody the same grade they earned just because she's a royal pain in the neck. Well, here's the problem. What would a utilitarian say do? She's really unhappy about her grade, right? She's making me really unhappy. I got to this point. Hopefully you guys have never had this. I'm sure you will at some point in life. Every time you open your email inbox, you get ready to, your stomach does a kind of a slow turn. I was in that situation with her, right? If I just changed the stupid grade, I'd put up with a lot less hassle. She would be happy. More than that, she kept on with this. At one point, she goes to the chair of the department. She gets her mother to come down from Northern Virginia to meet with the chair of the department. Look, if I just changed the grade, the chair would be happy. He wouldn't have to deal with this. Mother wouldn't have to drive down from Northern Virginia. So much happiness for so many people. It looks like the utilitarian would say, make the change. But I'm going to say I'm not going to do that because it is not fair. Now, a utilitarian could try to, play with the results in some ways. Say, well, maybe you're setting a bad example for her. Think about future consequences. And I would say two things. One, if I don't change the grade, it's not like she's going to learn a lesson. I think she'll probably just take the class from a professor who's not as stubborn as I am. Sorry, principled, I should say. And get the grade she wants. What's more, even if this response is right, it seems to miss the point. The reason I don't change her grade is not because I want to teach her a lesson or because I worry about future consequences. The reason I don't do it is it's not fair. And the utilitarian simply can't give that the weight it deserves. And the same goes with real-world cases and respect for persons. The utilitarian simply can't factor that in. Might be a little harder to think of this. You might have to go with a little more sci-fi cases. But imagine that you are a doctor. Someone who's a drug addict comes in and he's overdosed, and you think, well, should I save him? Of course you should save him. You're a doctor. But guess what? Turns out he's an organ donor, and you think to yourself, well, I could just not treat him, or I could just, help him on his way a little bit. Then I would have healthy organs to donate. He's not living well anyway. His life expectancy isn't going to be so great. If I kill him, I could save 5 people, and what's more, their life expectancy is probably better than him. We kill him, we take his organs. Now again, this is a little far out, But it's not that far out. And I think the answer is pretty clear. You don't kill him. That's not something you do to another human being. You cannot kill another human being to cut them up and take their organs. It seems hard for the utilitarian to account for that. Now, I think the utilitarian would say, well, in the real world, you would never do that because you might get caught. And if you get caught, think of the long-term consequences. You will go to jail. No one will ever want to donate organs. People are already paranoid enough about that. The long-term consequences, the possible bad consequences, aren't worth it. Well, that all might be true, but again, I would say to the utilitarian, you guys are simply missing the point. The point is that we don't do that to other people because people shouldn't be treated that way. They deserve a certain kind of respect. That respect doesn't fit with cutting them up for their organs. The utilitarian seems to simply miss that. One final objection: things besides consequences matter. For the utilitarian, it seems very hard not only to say that they shouldn't, it's very hard for them to make sense of the idea that these people should leave, but the idea that there's even anything admirable about leaving is very difficult for the utilitarian to admit. If they leave, it'll make them miserable. They're going to have to start a new life somewhere else. Not going to make any change in the city. What's the point in doing it? Creates unhappiness, doesn't create any happiness. But I think most of us would say, even if it doesn't create any happiness, there does seem to be some point in doing this. There does seem to be something admirable about it. Refusing to be part of an injustice, of something awful, that's admirable, even if refusing doesn't create good consequences. And again, if you want a more down-to-earth case, there's a nice one from Kant, and this is one that's actually taken from history. So imagine that you live in some nasty dictatorship, North Korea or somewhere like that. In Kant's example, it was actually England under the Tudor monarchs. And the dictator, or the king in this case, he wants to murder an innocent person, but he wants to make it look on the up and up, right? He wants to convict this innocent person of a crime they didn't commit. So the king, or his lackey, comes to you and says, well, look, we need this trial to look good, so we want you to say that you have evidence that this person's guilty, that you saw him do this thing, or you heard him tell you he did it. And you say, well, yeah, but he didn't. I don't think he is guilty. That never happened. And the king, or the dictator, or their lackey says to you, yeah, well, but guess what? If you don't say this, well, no matter what happens, we're gonna kill this guy. He's dead, right? If you don't do it, somebody else will. But guess what? If you don't tell the lie we want you to tell, you're gonna be dead too. Now look, I don't know what most of us would do. I don't know what I would do. Unfortunately, I suspect I might cave. But there does seem to be something clearly admirable about refusing to tell an innocent lie so that the king can murder an innocent person with a show trial, right? Utilitarianism simply can't admit that. Utilitarians would say, not only should you tell a lie, king's gonna kill, consequences of telling the lie are better than not, at least you won't be killed. But the utilitarian would say it would just be silly or mistaken not to tell the lie. But we don't believe that. We think that there's some value to virtue or good behavior here, even if it doesn't have good consequences. Now, Mill discusses this, and he says, well, virtue, good behavior, we only value it because it tends to have good consequences, tends to create the most happiness. I think cases like this show that we value what we might call virtue or doing one's duty, even if it doesn't have good consequences, even if it doesn't create the most happiness. If that's true, then something besides consequences matter, and that's something that the utilitarian simply can't admit. And that will be a problem for their theory. Kant, natural law theory, and virtue theory will all say that the utilitarian's wrong about this. They will all say that following the natural law or doing your duty or being virtuous are valuable, good things, even when they don't create the most happiness or have good consequences. The utilitarian simply cannot say that.